Hi, this presentation is looking back at the weather conditions that led to the 1996 floods across northwest Oregon and southwest Washington. When I started my career 32 years ago, I thought the Weather Service was at the cutting edge of technology and graphics. And yet, as I was putting the presentation together, I realized that we have certainly come a long way in that time frame in the way we can present information today. Let's start with one example here. This was a report that was done by the National Weather Service for the winter weather conditions from 1995 to 96. You can see the graphics are pretty crude that we had back then, and you can barely read some of the fonts and things that we have. But let's talk about what's here. We were experiencing a moderate La Nina event that winter. What that means is that the temperatures in the equator in the Pacific Ocean for the ocean temperatures were much colder than they normally are. When that happens, it shifts these jet streams northward. And so the Pacific jet stream coming across the Pacific Ocean was kind of focused into the Pacific Northwest region from British Columbia down to Northern California. And it also tends to bring some of those heavy rains and floods because it's getting blocked a bit by this stronger polar jet stream that's diving down out of Alaska and Canada into the central United States and keeping much of the northern U.S. cooler as well. So that was kind of a very persistent pattern that we had through that 3, 4, 5 month period starting from October into the February time frame. Here's a more representative graphic that shows what we can show you today. It's a lot more visually pleasing in my mind, but it does show the same kind of a pattern. This wasn't specifically 1995 to 96, but it does show that Pacific jet stream, the polar jet stream diving together, and temperatures tending to be cooler to the north of that jet and wetter along it. So, back in 1995 and 96, we had a couple of significant weather events. Two of them were atmospheric river events, the ones that bring really, really heavy rainfall into the area as moisture plumes across the Pacific. The first one really got the ground primed and wet as we got into the cooler season, and it doesn't evaporate as easily out of there. It was November 22nd to December 3rd, and pretty much it was rain in that episode. Temperatures were just a little too warm to get really significant snowfall into the Cascades and into the coastal range. But the second event, this is the one that was right as the flooding was going to happen, created 10 to 16 inches of precipitation. This graphic in the upper left is showing those precipitation totals. 16 inches in the coastal range and in the central Cascades of Washington, and then we have a good 8 to 12 inches showing up for the Cascades in Oregon as well. One of the things in this graphic that really stood out to me was that June Lake, which is on the south end of Mount St. Helens, had almost 42 to 43 inches of not only precipitation and snowfall, it was combined in that 4 to 5 day period in February. So we've got, 42 inches or so of moisture at one location in a 4 to 5 day period. I just want to point out that Portland's annual precipitation for 365 days is on average 37 inches. So June Lake had more rain in 4 days than we typically would see in a year in Portland. All right, but these are the two events, but there's one more. It wasn't necessarily an atmospheric river event, but we had a very, very heavy snow event in the Cascades. From January 19th to the 29th, the government camp received 90 inches of snowfall. Let's dive into that a little bit more in a few slides. So this slide here, again, showing the crude graphics that we had 30 years ago, but you can definitely see that it was wetter across most of the northern United States and much drier to the south with that La Nina pattern that we had. If we took those graphics and created them today, I think we can do a little bit better. You can see different climate divisions showing out here, but certainly from Central California across Oregon into Washington, you can see we were more than 12 plus inches above normal for precipitation for the winter weather months. But what's interesting is the temperatures. Again, that polar jet was diving down across the central United States. So the eastern half of the country was much colder while the western half was warmer. And some of that was just above normal for temperatures in Oregon, with maybe just the north central part of the state just slightly below normal. So we didn't really have an extended, really cold period over that 3 to 4 month period. Let's take a look closely at government camp. We're going to start there from November 1st to February 28th. Here's a look at some of the daily high and low temperatures. The first event that we had that I said was too warm for much snowfall, you can see that on a couple of these days here, the low temperature, which is the bottom of the blue line, is actually warmer than the normal high temperature. So the lows were warmer than the normal highs in this event. So kind of hard to get snowfall in there. Here was the big heavy snow event, though, for the 10-day period. Temperatures were pretty much right around normal and gradually falling most days. And then we had a big giant event that brought in much, much colder weather. So all this 90 inches of new snow and then a real significant freeze. And then around February 5th, we had a very big warm up again. And now we're back up here where we went from extreme cold for almost a week to record high temperatures and near record high temperatures. So this was certainly a contributing factor to the flooding that happened, creating that runoff very, very quickly. So looking at that first AR event at government camp, they had 16.75 inches from November 22nd to December 3rd, which is about 3 times as much as you should normally get in that time period. The heavy snow event, 11.14 inches of precipitation fell, which also, again, 3 times what they should have been normally getting in that 10-day period. And now we're adding more rain on top of all of this, and we're warming temperatures up. And in this time frame from February 5th through the 9th, government camp had 12.37 inches of precipitation, which is about 7 times what it normally should be getting. At the end of the season, if we look at the end of the blue line, we were at 79 inches of precipitation at government camp, and normal is about 50. So we were almost 30 inches above normal for this 4-month time period. Now let's take a look at the snowfall. Leading up to that big 10-day, 90-inch event, we were actually in a snow drought in the Cascades. They were well below normal. You can see that there's a pretty big gap from the normal line, the brown line, to the green, which was the actual observed every day. And then it hit, and we got into that 10-day period with 90 inches of snow. When you look at the end of this season here, though, at the end of February, we were actually 3 inches below normal for that 4-month period. So it just goes to show that one event can make a huge, huge difference in what we're seeing for snowpack in the Cascades. Let's look at this again in Portland. We're going to just focus in on the end of January and February. Again, you can see that very, very cold air that came in, that event that came in. Portland also had some snow in this period, like government camp did, about 8 inches, and then it froze. It stuck around, and then we had this huge warm-up. So again, everything is melting off. You can see here there's almost a record high, near record high temperatures by the time we get to the 7th, 8th, and 9th of February, as the flooding is really ongoing at this point. So Portland precipitation, not as impressive as government camp, but we don't have the topography to help with the orographic lifting. But Portland had 5.62 inches in the November event. We had 3.58 inches in the January event with the snowfall, and both of those are about twice what they normally should be. And then as we got into February 5th, we ended up with 7.05 inches of precipitation, which is almost 10 times what we normally would see in that 4 to 5 day period. Throughout this event here, Portland, you can see the green line for the end of this 4-month period was at 33.83 inches. Again, the normal precipitation for Portland is 37 inches. So in 4 months, we almost had a year's worth of precipitation. And there's that snowfall event that Portland also had in there. We haven't had much snow at all this year in the area, so it's kind of interesting to just go back and look at 1 or 2 events that we did have. This one was just around 8 inches of snow for that 10-day period that Mount Hood had 90 inches in. So I want to now take a quick look at a historical story map that one of our students did for us. Orion Hoke was a high school student through the Saturday Academy program, and he put together all this data. He went back and got all the hourly gridded precipitation data and the river gauge data to show the precipitation that fell during some of these events. So here we are. It is February 5th, 1996, and he is showing this precipitation by hour. And the blue dots are the river gauges. And as the river gauges start to increase in height, then we start hitting minor and moderate flooding. You're seeing the blue bubbles getting larger and larger. You can see the Willamette Valley is the last to fill, but it's also the largest because the amount of precipitation that was melting into the river basin. And precipitation slowly ends around the 9th of February. But it takes a couple of days for those river gauges to actually remove the water that's in the system. So you can see that it kind of lingers, and we have a few remaining showers in the days after February 9th. So Orion went down and actually created the flood severity based on the maximum crest, and you can see all of the purple dots were sites that hit major flooding. So this wasn't just the Willamette Valley, it was these tributaries, and it was the coastal range as well that were dealing with flooding throughout this event. And the last graphic he has here shows the precipitation totals from February 5th all the way through the 13th. And again, the coastal range took a very large amount, 30 to 40 inches are in here. And then in the Cascades of Washington and Oregon, we're looking at anywhere from 15 to 25 inches of precipitation that fell in that time period. So this story map is available online. The link will be ready for you with this recording, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the weather that occurred prior to the 1996 floods and during the actual event.